Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes, where we're embarking on a profound deep dive into a truly pivotal and chilling period of history. Our guide today is Stephen Kotkin's meticulously researched and monumental work, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929-1941. Now, this isn't just a standard biography. It's more like an immersive journey into a decade that really shaped the 20th century in profound ways. We'll be exploring the transformative and, well, often brutal years from 1929, leading us right up to the doorstep of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941.
Yeah, and what Kotkin just does so masterfully in this volume, it's this incredible examination of Stalin's rise to absolute, totally unchallengeable power. And crucially, how that power reshaped not just a nation, but really the entire world stage. We'll trace the devastating impact of his most radical policies, things like forced collectivization, breakneck industrialization, which, cost millions of lives. We'll also dig into the terrifying descent into the Great Purge, a period of state-sponsored terror that's almost unfathomable in its scale. And really key to understanding it all, we'll analyze his complex, sometimes contradictory foreign policy moves that ultimately set the stage for World War II. Kotkin doesn't just cover the events, he gets deep into Stalin's psyche, his motivations, and the actual nuts and bolts, the mechanisms he used to build and keep his dictatorship.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Starting in 1929, which Kotkin presents as this moment of terrifying acceleration in Soviet history. He really pulls no punches, throwing us straight into the chaos of collectivization, a policy that, as he shows, would just fundamentally change the USSR and its people. It really pushed the country into this era of unprecedented suffering and state control.
Absolutely. And what Kotkin really brings out is Stalin's almost steely resolve during the mass starvation that came directly from collectivization. He shows Stalin as just completely unyielding, even when facing, serious criticism from within the party and the awful reality of famine spreading. Kotkin emphasizes how this whole period amplified Stalin's already deeply suspicious and frankly vindictive nature, which only got worse as his personal dictatorship solidified. And to understand that mindset, Kotkin even looks at his early life, growing up across from a cathedral, going to seminary, thinking maybe he'd be a priest. But even then, as a seminarian, he was secretly reading banned books, starting with Victor Hugo, then moving on to revolutionary stuff. Kotkin suggests this mix, the rigid religious background and then these forbidden revolutionary ideas, really shaped his worldview later on. It fueled that relentless drive to build socialism, no matter the human cost.
And the human cost was just staggering, wasn't it? Kotkin goes into meticulous detail about how Stalin, in December 1929, basically overruled his own commission. He just unilaterally announced the policy of eliminating the kulak as a class, which sounds vague but was terrifyingly real. It unleashed this ruthless persecution of millions of peasants. And the peasant resistance, Kotkin shows, was immediate and surprisingly widespread. The secret police, the OGPU, they recorded over, 6,500 spontaneous anti-Soviet group protests in March 1930 alone.
That's right. Thousands.
And it wasn't like a formal civil war, Kotkin stresses that, but the level of anger and desperation was intense. It led to the assassination of over 1,100 rural officials. It really paints a picture of a state at war with its own rural population.
Yeah, and that resistance, even though it was ultimately crushed, it just highlights the sheer brutality of Stalin's vision. Kotkin shows Stalin pushing relentlessly for this drive to build socialism, setting impossible goals like fulfilling the first 5-year plan in just 4 years. Industrialization wasn't just economics, it was framed as a class war, a revolutionary fight against anyone deemed an alien element.
Right.
But then Kotkin gives us the harsh reality. By spring 1932, despite all the propaganda and forced labor, industrial output was actually stagnating, even falling in places. And here's a really crucial, chilling point Kotkin brings out. Even with internal fears about the harvest and global grain prices crashing, the Soviets kept exporting huge amounts of grain. By late 1930, they'd captured something like 15% of the world market share.
Wow. During a famine.
Exactly. Kotkin argues this wasn't about profit, it was a deliberate state-imposed deprivation, using starvation as an economic tool, basically, forcing their own people to starve to pay off foreign debts and fund industrialization. It just completely redefines what national priorities meant under Stalin.
It's horrific. And amidst all this national catastrophe, Kotkin gives us these really fascinating glimpses into Stalin's personal life. They stand in such stark contrast to his public image. Like, he mentions a letter from June 1930 where Stalin writes to his wife Nadia saying he misses her, feels alone like an owl. But at the exact same time, Kotkin describes him totally absorbed in these incredibly complex, nasty bits of infighting among party bosses, especially down near his holiday place in the Caucasus. It's such a strange juxtaposition, isn't it? Private feelings versus ruthless public maneuvering.
That tension really deepens as Kotkin moves into the growing repression that started to swallow the party itself. The purges just escalated dramatically in the early 30s. In 1929-30, it was maybe 1 in 10 party members expelled. Kotkin points out that by the early 30s, it jumped to nearly 1 in 5.
Wow.
Dossiers were piling up on everyone. They became these powerful tools of control. Kotkin even tells the story of how Voroshilov, a Politburo member, had to actively push back against OGPU provocations targeting his own aide.
Even at that level.
Yeah, it shows how pervasive the suspicion was right up to the top. And this period also saw that horrific famine of 1933 particularly bad in Ukraine. Kotkin is clear. This wasn't just bad weather. Contemporaries, like the Italian ambassador who actually traveled through Ukraine, called it deliberate. And Kotkin's research really backs that up, pointing to it as a state-engineered disaster driven by Moscow's policies and, frankly, indifference.
Which then leads us to the so-called Congress of Victors in early 1934. It seemed like a celebration, but Kotkin peels back the layers to show simmering discontent. There were actually whispers, real whispers, about maybe replacing Stalin. It shows this hidden tension. And then bang, the event that really lit the fuse for the terror. Kirov's assassination, December 1st, 1934. Kotkin goes into the details, the immediate rumors about Kirov having an affair, and the incredibly suspicious death of his bodyguard, Borisov. His head smashed against a wall while being driven by NKVD agents.
Yeah, it hardly looks accidental.
Right. Kotkin doesn't explicitly say Stalin ordered it, but he lays out how convenient it all was.
And Kirov's murder, as Kotkin powerfully argues, became the absolute catalyst for the widespread terror that followed. The show trials kicked off, like the famous one in January 1935 with Zinoviev and Kamenev. They weren't even accused of direct involvement in the murder.
Right, it was about the moral atmosphere.
Exactly, accused of fostering an atmosphere that allowed terrorism. But what's really chilling, and Kotkin highlights this, is Stalin's immediate reaction. He sent out this letter to all party organizations, basically equating anyone who'd ever been in opposition with White Guard wreckers, spies, and provocateurs. And he explicitly said just expelling them from the party was insufficient. Kotkin argues that letter was pretty much the public launch of the spy mania that would consume the country. It gave the ideological green light for everything that came next.
So how did Stalin actually manage to hold on to such absolute control through all this chaos and terror? Kotkin's analysis here is really interesting. He talks about Stalin's colossal authority resting on 3 main pillars. First, this dedicated faction he built within the party. Second, the huge state machine, especially the secret police that he controlled. And third, the Marxist-Leninist ideology that he kind of shaped and used.
Right.
But Kotkin adds this fascinating, almost terrifying paradox. But his power wasn't just top-down. It was magnified hugely by ordinary people projecting their own hopes onto him, hopes for justice, peace, prosperity, national greatness.
Yeah, it's a really crucial point.
It became this weird fusion of deliberate control and, well, warped popular aspiration, making him seem almost indispensable.
And that immense power, built partly on that projection, was then turned around to unleash the absolute horror of the Great Purge in 37-38. Kotkin gives the numbers, and they're just staggering, hard to even comprehend. 1,575,259 arrests, mostly political, and 681,692 executions. He explains that Stalin's charges, especially for espionage, weren't based on facts at all. It was this political equation, basically his own paranoia, his obsession with wiping out any perceived enemy, even imagined ones. Kotkin shows the accusations were often completely preposterous, defying any logical explanation, but it worked. It solidified his power through just pervasive, random fear. The regime was literally eating itself.
And that atmosphere of fear just got thicker with Orjonikidze's death in February 1937. He was a close ally, but apparently had challenged Stalin. The official story blamed Trotskyite degenerates, of course. But Kotkin notes the rumors in Moscow were immediate and pointed directly at Stalin.
Yeah, the timing was certainly suspicious.
And this event, this chilling context, really paves the way for the rise of someone even more ruthless, Lavrentiy Beria.
Beria's rise, as Kotkin lays it out, was incredibly fast and incredibly brutal. He had this track record from Georgia, crushing opposition there. He took over the NKVD, the secret police, with terrifying efficiency. He helped get rid of his predecessors, Yagoda and then Yezhov. And Kotkin draws this parallel. Beria, he says, like Stalin, was easily offended, obsessed with slights, a real keeper and settler of scores.
A chilling similarity.
Absolutely. It made him the perfect, utterly loyal tool for Stalin's increasingly paranoid rule. And under Beria, Kotkin notes, the number of Georgians in the NKVD shot up dramatically. He brought in his own network of ruthless operators.
Okay, so while all this brutal consolidation is happening internally, Stalin's also navigating a really complex foreign policy landscape, often in quite contradictory ways. You see moves like the Franco-Soviet Pact and joining the League of Nations in 1934, which look like efforts towards collective security against fascism.
Right, on the surface.
But then Kotkin reveals this crucial contradiction. Even though Litvinov, the Soviet foreign minister, was clearly warning about German aggression in 1935, warning about Hitler's aims for revanche and domination in Europe, Stalin's own Comintern policy had actually been undermining those efforts, this bizarre social fascism line where they basically labeled moderate socialists as enemies just as bad as fascists.
Yeah, it was disastrous.
It effectively sabotaged any chance of a united front against Hitler, didn't it? It fragmented the opposition and kind of inadvertently helped the Nazis.
That social fascism directive is such a critical piece of the puzzle in Kotkin's analysis. And if you link that to what was happening globally, the Spanish Civil War, starting in July 1936, really threw these contradictions into sharp relief. Stalin sent some aid to the Republicans, sure, but Franco was getting massive support from Italy and Germany, and Trotsky's critique, which Kotkin mentions, was scathing. He saw Stalin's actions in Spain not as real revolutionary support, but as a betrayal, prioritizing Soviet state interests above everything else. Then comes the Munich Agreement in September 1938. The Western powers appease Hitler, sacrificing Czechoslovakia. That just cemented Stalin's distrust of the West. Kotkin notes that during that crisis, Stalin literally vanished from public view for over 100 hours. Clearly a sign of deep worry, maybe furious recalculation.
And recalculate he certainly did. Which brings us to August 1939 and the absolute bombshell, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. How on earth did that happen after all the anti-Nazi talk?
Well, Kotkin explains it as a consequence of failed diplomacy and deep cynicism on Stalin's part. Those earlier attempts to ally with Britain and France, they stalled. Mutual suspicion ran too deep. The West wasn't ready for solid military commitments. So Stalin made this dramatic, utterly pragmatic pivot, signed the non-aggression pact with Germany, complete with that secret protocol dividing up Eastern Europe.
Shocking the world.
Completely. For Stalin, Kotkin argues, it was pure strategy. Buy time, grab territory. And in the invasion of Poland that followed, Soviet casualties were tiny deads. Kotkin says around 700 dead compared to Germany's losses. Stalin was apparently very satisfied. He saw it as getting back old imperial Russian lands, basically reversing losses from the war with Poland in the 1920s and pushing Soviet borders west. Ruthless but effective expansion from his point of view.
But then, almost immediately, comes the Winter War with Finland, starting November 1939. And as Kotkin shows, this was a serious wake-up call. It wasn't the easy victory Moscow anticipated at all.
Not even close. And Kotkin really details the arrogance involved. Stalin demanded huge chunks of Finnish territory, land near Leningrad, a naval base. But the Red Army, despite having way more troops, tanks, planes, they really struggled against the Finns, took massive casualties. Kotkin points out Stalin's reaction. Immediately blamed subordinates, dismissed the chief of staff's plan as unworthy, classic Stalin. But Kotkin also cites Mannerheim, the Finnish leader, who saw this inertia in the Red Army command, maybe suggesting deeper problems, like a rigid, fear-driven system, not just bad tactics. The war definitely exposed major weaknesses.
For Soviet confidence in their own military took a big hit. Kotkin mentions Molotov's almost cheerful congratulations to Germany after France just collapsed so quickly in May-June 1940. It sounds like Moscow was genuinely shocked by how fast and effective the German blitzkrieg was. That victory just changed the whole game in Europe.
Yeah, the shock was real. And for Hitler, that swift victory seemed to confirm his plans. Kotkin shows how, in July 1940, Hitler makes the final decision to invade the USSR. He saw Russia as Britain's last hope. Smash Russia, he thought, and Britain would have to give up. Yet, incredibly, when Molotov goes to Berlin in November 1940, Stalin's own ambitions are soaring. Kotkin reveals Stalin's new demands were astonishing. Bulgaria in the Soviet sphere, control of the Turkish Straits, even lands south towards the Persian Gulf.
Wow, even then.
Even then. While Hitler is clearly planning his move, Stalin's still trying to cut this grand deal with Germany, completely misreading the situation, misreading Hitler's actual intentions.
Which brings us to what Kotkin presents as arguably Stalin's most catastrophic failure of judgment. Despite getting multiple, very credible intelligence warnings in early 1941, we're talking direct reports from top spies like Richard Sorge, detailed analysis from military attachés like Tupikov. Stalin just stubbornly refused to believe it.
He was convinced Hitler would issue an ultimatum first, maybe demand concessions, not launch an all-out invasion. It's almost baffling, that level of denial.
Why? What was blinding him?
Kotkin puts a lot of it down to Stalin's ideological blinders. He was just fundamentally obsessed with British imperialism. That colored how he saw everything. He was convinced the British were trying to trick the USSR into war with Germany, even long after Hitler had torn up the old order and shown his real ambitions.
Fixated on the wrong enemy.
Exactly. This deep-seated Marxist-Leninist paranoia about Britain obscured the immediate existential threat from Germany. And then you have that May 1941 speech Kotkin mentions, where Stalin wildly inflates the Red Army's strength, claiming 300 divisions, a third of them mechanized. It was pure wishful thinking, self-deception almost. A stark example of belief overriding reality.
And this rigid thinking, this denial, it continued right up to the very last days before June 22nd, 1941. Kotkin describes these explicit reports coming in, German embassy staff evacuating burning documents, clear signs something big was about to happen.
Undeniable signs.
Yet Stalin still rejected calls for a general mobilization. His biggest fear, Kotkin argues, was that mobilizing would provoke Hitler, that it would be tantamount to war.
He was so afraid of provoking the attack that he ignored all the signs the attack was already locked in, already coming, paralyzed by the wrong fear.
A tragic irony.
It really is.
Yeah.
And in Stalin, waiting for Hitler, Kotkin just masterfully connects all these threads. The deep paranoia, the ruthless power consolidation, and then these profound strategic miscalculations. It all combined, paving the way for one of the most horrific conflicts in human history. He paints this picture of a leader who was incredibly shrewd in some ways, yet disastrously blind to the ultimate threat.
Yeah, what Kotkin really illuminates is that stark tension, isn't it, between Stalin, the brutal, effective domestic tyrant who crushed all opposition, and Stalin, the foreign policy leader who completely misjudged Hitler, despite all the evidence. It really forces you, the listener, to grapple with that paradox. A leader monstrously clever in one arena, yet catastrophically blinkered in another, blinded by his own ideology and fears.
Yeah.
So for you, thinking about this deep dive into Kotkin's work, maybe the takeaway is how even with absolute power, even with a huge intelligence apparatus, a leader's own fixed beliefs, their personal demons, can tragically warp their perception of reality. The consequences, as we see here, can be devastating, echoing across continents and down through generations. It really makes you ask, doesn't it? How do our own fixed ideas, maybe born from past experiences or strong convictions, shape how we see threats and opportunities today? Could they be blinding us even now? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Stephen Kotkin's Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929-1941. We certainly hope you found it as illuminating and thought-provoking as we did.